There is a difference between immersion and realism, however they are inextricably linked. Video games will portray reality in different degrees of accuracy depending on what kind of game they're making and who they're trying to appeal to. And if you ask a bunch of gamers whether or not realism in video games is good or bad, you'll probably get a whole host of different answers. It just depends on taste for the most part. However, there are some aspects of reality that lend themselves well to video games, and there are many aspects of it that simply do not. It all depends on who you're trying to sell to and what kind of vibe you want to get from your game. Titanfall 2, which is what you're seeing now, it gives you an entirely different flavor of experience compared to, say, a more realistic game like Arma or even DayZ. They're not the same games, and they certainly weren't designed to be. One is much more realistic than the other. That doesn't mean it's better, but again, it depends on who you ask. So it's easy to answer the question of which one is more realistic. Obviously, the one with the people jumping around and running on walls and the giant mech robots and the laser beam, not going to be quite as realistic as a game that strives to be a simulator for modern military combat with modern weapons and bullet physics and things of that like. Obviously, one is going to be more realistic than the other. But which one is more immersive? Titanfall 2 has one of the best single-player experiences I've ever played in a shooter. It certainly was one of the best single-player games of 2016. Arma 3 and DayZ, examples I'll go back to because a lot of people have experienced these games and can relate to them better. These games, well, they have a immersive vibe to them as well. The environments, the look of the characters, the scale of the world in which you inhabit and move around in. But which one's more immersive? Do you need realism to be immersive? Can your game be so real, or attempt to be so real, that you actually hurt your immersion? Is the abandonment of realistic aspects that we find in our own daily lives perhaps what makes games more realistic? Let's look at DayZ. Love it, hate it. It's certainly been a controversial project and continues to be. I basically don't touch it at all anymore. Maybe if they updated it every once in a while, I would. DayZ is a game that strives to be a survival simulator with great reliance on realistic aspects in it. Now, when a game says that it touts realism, it straddles a line between the frustrating and unplayable and the impossible to copy, and the approximation of realism. You see this in games like Battlefield. Battlefield's a series that really isn't realistic, but it does have the realistic components in it that help you to understand where it's coming from. So it would be an arcade-style shooter, sure, but it'll have things like bullet travel time and bullet drop, but we'll get into that in a moment. DayZ is a game where you have to consume food and water in order to survive. That's realistic. You have to eat and you have to drink or else you'll die. But you don't have to consume them at realistic rates. It's a game where you can drink a liter of water and still be thirsty. It is a game where you can bleed profusively, but a zombie punching you will cause you to start bleeding so much that you have to bandage yourself or you will bleed to death. It's a give and take of, this is an aspect of reality that truly exists, but the way that it's executed in the game, or whatever triggers these things to occur, or the levels at which the game relies on them, isn't to a realistic standard. There are many games that require you, for instance, to consume food and drink with your character in order to not die. For many gamers, just the fact that you have to upkeep your character's bodily necessities is enough for them to be immersed in the world because they have to do something that they also do in real life. The rate at which they must consume and the nutritional value of the objects they consume isn't so much of an important aspect. People understand they have to eat and drink in a video game, and as such, they can roll with it. They can deal with it. They're not going to look too deeply into it. And yes, just like getting punched by a zombie will cause you to bleed so much you have to bandage up in order to prevent death from that profuse bleeding, which is immensely unrealistic, of course. At least it's based on the idea that if your character takes damage, you must medicate yourself in order to prevent further injury. Everybody knows in a survival scenario, after all, since DayZ is attempting to become a survival game one day, that, yeah, you can't just let your body get thrashed around. Yeah, it's excessive that you'll bleed to death from being punched. We'll just blame that one on early access. In any event, let's get back to, Titanfall 2 that you've been watching here. Titanfall 2 single player is one of the best shooter games I've played of 2016, and it's overall an extremely high quality game, and you should be trying it on the free weekends and buying it, hopefully. It is a excellent game. One of the reasons being because it's very immersive, which is very strange when you see me playing it, and there are these giant robots walking around and the lasers, and we've been over this. The same thing happens in Star Wars games and movies. We can immerse ourselves in Star Wars games and movies, despite knowing that they're definitely not realistic, because everything in the universe comes together to create this cohesive setting, atmosphere, universe, lore that we can accept as reality. Both Titanfall 2 and Star Wars, they are able to... Star Wars? Anyway, they're able to both immerse you in the worlds despite their immense lack of realism, because everything that is portrayed to you is done so well. A lot of it has to do with graphics. How does it look? The design of the machines and the weapons, the character models. Does it make any sense we have futuristic space soldiers running around walls and jumping off the bottoms of ceiling holes with their fart blasters? No, it doesn't make any sense at all. But you can absolutely believe it. Or at least you can put to the side your disbelief of it and just roll with it, just like you do with Star Wars or Lord of the Rings. The sound of the guns, the look of the robots, everything about this game allows you to immerse yourself in this chaotic, honestly rather silly world. You know it's a video game, you understand you're playing a video game, you know what it's trying to be, and that's okay. Let's take a detour to Dirty Bomb. Here's some lovely gameplay. So, Dirty Bomb is a game that is very arcadey, even more so than Call of Duty would be. In every sense of the word, it's a game like Overwatch or Team Fortress 2. In that same vein, you play a hero, there are objectives, there are people on the other team, you shoot them in the face with your gun, you throw ammo and health packs, and you make things happen, and there are noises and bullets, and life's ding-a-dairy. But there's really nothing realistic or all that immersive about Dirty Bomb. It's just one of these arcadey style shooters that I enjoy immensely because the gameplay mechanics are really, really solid, and it's just an enjoyable game for me to play. I've sunk, 4,500 hours into this game, and you don't have to immerse yourself in a game like Dirty Bomb to really enjoy it. Immersion, realism, these things are not necessary. Though a lot of the times, it's not necessary because the games that you play don't really have a narrative interest or necessity in making you believe the world or the characters is real. The characters in Dirty Bomb basically amount to, this character is this set of little one-liners and funny things that they say. And we piece that together on the internet, and we say, okay, this is what this character's personality is like. We don't have to immerse you in this game or put you in that character's shoes. They just have this, set of traits, and you use them, and they have a gun, and you shoot the gun, and there are other people. We can compare this to Overwatch, which I mentioned a moment ago. Overwatch, to me, isn't immersive at all. I don't ever feel like I'm in the world of Overwatch, whatever that even means. I mean, I think they're being a little optimistic about the state of Africa in the future. But Overwatch is a game that relies heavily on you enjoying the personalities and the personal lores of the characters, and at the same time, I don't feel in any way immersed in the setting. It all depends on where a game's focused on. Overwatch doesn't focus on immersing you in the world. And if it does, then it didn't do a good job. I don't think there's any disconnect between Overwatch's world and me being able to play it and have fun. It's just not really that immersive. When I'm playing Overwatch, I'm never able to lose myself in it. In at least the sense that I say, oh yeah, that's right, I'm playing a video game, I'm not actually here. That's something that I would maybe think about, what would my most immersive game be? What game, more than any other, allows me to put myself in the shoes of the character that I'm controlling? What game allows me to believe I'm in an environment? What game makes me, more than anything else, go, oh yeah, by the way, you're not actually here, you're playing a video game. You're sitting in an apartment in Arkansas. Well, the most immersive game I have ever played is Soma. Soma is a science fiction themed horror game, full of suspense. It's very chilling, it's tense, and the story is amazing. It has this existential sort of thematic element to it, and then, look, play Soma. If you're into immersive games, I'm telling you, it is the most immersive game I've ever played. And the game itself is spooky, the world is very well imagined, the way that the atmosphere is portrayed, the way the environment is shown, it draws you in, and it sucks you in, and it doesn't let go. More than any other game, I have felt like I was part of this world. I was part of Soma. I was down there beneath the ocean in these facilities. I was trudging along the seafloor. I could believe I was there. I lost myself when I was playing this game. The game made me forget that I was playing a game. And that's what the most immersive games do. They make you forget you're playing a video game. In Soma's case, it owes a lot of its immersion to the fact that its science fiction theme is portrayed in a way that's very believable. You can have unbelievable places, like Titanfall, for instance, and still immerse yourself in that world, just like Star Wars. But with Soma, it's a lot easier because the world of Soma is much more grounded in reality. It seems much more familiar. And familiarity can lend itself a great deal to the immersion of a video game. When we enter fantasy worlds, if we don't recognize anything, and if we don't know what anything is, it can be more difficult for us to immerse ourselves in the world. There are examples, of course, because any game, any developer, if they do it right, can make even the most foreign, exotic, and unrelatable worlds possible to immerse ourselves in. Let's take what are two good examples are Skyrim and the Shivering Isles. Skyrim is based much more on a realistic culture and a realistic kind of artistic depiction that we see in Norse and Nordic art. It definitely has that flavor to it. It has that inspiration. It's much more typical in the way that we see fantasy Western RPG worlds created. Shivering Isles, though, is much more strange. It has a very much fantastical sort of quality to it that Skyrim doesn't possess. It is almost like an Alice in Wonderland style adventure. It's the Lewis Carroll version of the Elder Scrolls. It is strange and unusual, and we see all this odd imagery that you don't get in a lot of other fantasy games. Dragon Age is another example of a more traditional kind of depiction of Western-themed role-playing games. That helps immerse yourself a lot more in the world as well. You don't have to spend a lot of time trying to process new types of things that you see. You can just roll with it a lot more easily. But at the same time, it's all down to depiction. It's all in the execution of how these games play out and how the environment is detailed. But a lot of our ability to immerse ourselves in video games doesn't just come from the video game ourselves, but it's up to the individual, of course. Some people find it a lot more easier for them to lose themselves in worlds, and I don't mean just focusing hard on winning, right? Games like Counter-Strike Go, Dirty Bomb, there is a level of competitiveness to the game, and we often find ourselves hunching closer to the screen and biting our lip and really focusing on the screen and wanting to win. That's not the kind of immersion I'm talking about here. I think it's a lot more easy for someone who plays a lot of video games, who consumes a lot of fantasy, everything from Warhammer to the Elder Scrolls to Fallout, Someone who plays a lot of fantasy games, who plays characters in a lot of fantasy games, I think they're more used to kind of letting go of reality and getting into the escapism aspect that is video games. I think it's a lot easier for someone who reads a lot of books to kind of almost train themselves, maybe even subconsciously, to just letting go, to just losing yourself. A lot of people read books and play games for exactly this reason, to forget about real life and just have fun somewhere else. To live a life you never could possibly live in the real world. What's that old saying they have on t-shirts? I don't play video games because I have no life. I play video games because I want to live many lives. To many people, video games are more than just challenges to overcome. They are ways to escape from reality for just a moment, for just a while, lose yourself in fantasy. Some games deal with realism and immersion differently than others. Let's take a game that's really recent, Battlefield 1. Battlefield 1 is a game that takes place within a historical context. Battlefield 1 takes place in the late 19-teens, World War I. Unlike fantasy worlds where many things are crafted on imagination, where designers and artists and developers will create a universe based on things instead of looking at things that actually existed and just copying that for the purposes of imitation because of the theme, you have Battlefield 1 that does just that. Battlefield 1 is attempting to recreate within a proper context. The context being it's a video game and it's got an arcade sort of feel to it, stuff like that. Battlefield 1 is recreating a real historical time with real historical weapons and real historical places. In a sense, Battlefield 1 has a rule book that fantasy games like Skyrim and Oblivion and others do not have. They have to play by the rules of history and examples and how things actually looked. But at the same time, they have to make a Battlefield game that's fun and interesting to play, keeping all that in mind. So one thing that Battlefield 1 does is it does a good job in immersing yourself without being realistic really at all. There's a level of believability that comes especially from, I think, what is really not much of a criticism of the game. A lot of people play Battlefield 1 and they say, well, this isn't realistic. No soldier in World War I on the such and such front uses such and such weapon that you can play as. This Hellregal SMG was experimental. No one really used it in combat. And this gun here, it was only used at the very, very end of the war in extremely limited numbers. That you don't see people running around with it. I hate that criticism. I really don't think that's a good criticism of a game that's being a video game first and doesn't focus on history primarily, but only uses it as a set of guidelines. So, like I said, there's a Hellregal submachine gun in Battlefield 1 that any person on the battlefield can equip, right? Even though it never really saw combat, it was experimental in design. Would you really know that if somebody hadn't told you? Because the gun looks period accurate, because it is. It was a real weapon. It existed. We have pictures. You can believe that this was a weapon of the time period that soldiers might have used. And that's kind of more the point. They're not trying to create a textbook on World War I infantry combat. They're trying to immerse you in a setting or a theme. It looks like it's from World War I. It sounds like it could be from World War I. And so you go with it. You roll with it. And we abandoned the realism of, the people actually running around and battle with it. Yeah, it didn't happen. We abandoned that just like we abandoned a lot of things in order to immerse ourselves. That's why you can have a tank that could get hit by another tank with an explodey tank shell, and you can get out and smack it with a hammer, and all of a sudden it gets better. Much like in Battlefield 4 or 3. Oh, I see the tank is on fire. Let me use this blowtorch to put it out. When talking about realism in games like Battlefield, for instance, people will say, well, it's not realistic that you have this one experimental weapon that was never deployed en masse to troops on a front in battle. And then they'll say it's not realistic, but you can revive people and bring them back from the dead. Or you can always make your reloads perfectly. Or bullets always go in the exact middle of your screen. Different things have different levels of believability, and that relates to immersion. We as video gamers are used to respawning in video games. You die, you live, you die, you live, you die, you respawn, you play the game. It's so commonplace in shooters to respawn that gamers have accepted that as just part of the world. It's just something that a video game does. In fact, games where there is no respawn mechanic are not the norm. Modes where you only have one life per round, these are not the rule. They are normally the exception. It is perhaps the most unrealistic aspect of a video game, and yet, in a strange way, it is the most unusual to not see in a video game, regardless of how realistic that game's trying to be. That's why it would be more unrealistic. That's why it would be less immersive to see a character running around in World War I with, say, an AK-47, than it would to see you watch a soldier respawn and come back to life before your very eyes. One of them is a staple, a commonplace of shooters and video games. The other is you using a gun that is obviously not period specific, within a game that has a defined set of guidelines. That being the historical context. Not all aspects of a video game are the same in terms of how believable they are or how immersive they are. This issue arose when I made a video of mine that went viral a while back. Battlefield 1 is sexist, apparently. People were making the argument that there is already so many unrealistic things in Battlefield, and really in video games in general, that it shouldn't matter if there are women running around in a World War I shooter game. Even though having women on the front lines in a historical Battlefield game, of course, would be far, 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 far more immersion breaking than having a gun that is period accurate and that actually existed but wasn't truly deployed to frontline troops, things of that nature. You can't put these things on the same level. And across all kinds of games, immersion can be really, really important because when you feel like you're immersed in a video game and you're actually doing the things in it, and when you can lose yourself in the game, it gives you more of a vested interest a lot of the times, either in finishing it or even in recommending it. It's a lot easier for somebody to recommend a video game if they feel like that was something that I did. Feeling like you're actually there and actually doing things can give you a sense of a personal connection with the game and the experience. This will help you do things like relate to the characters in the game and be empathetic to their struggles. If you meet characters in a poorly imagined world that you can't feel any connection to, a lot of the times that means you won't be able to feel any connection to the characters. As a result, you'll be completely apathetic to their struggles when the game is trying to make you feel like you should care. Take a game like The Witcher 3, which is my favorite game of all time. It's really easy to put yourself into the world and imagine yourself in it. It is very, very immersive. As a result, the characters who are written very well and animated very well and are fleshed out, it's really easy for you to actually care about them. It's easy for you to listen to characters and feel like they have actual problems even though they're just pixels on a screen. It's very easy to be empathetic towards characters in games like The Witcher 3. These NPCs don't feel like strangers in a place that you're visiting. These NPCs feel like fellow denizens of a world that you also inhabit. Let's compare this to Mass Effect Andromeda. Granted, I've only played about an hour or so of it so far, and I'm already kind of hesitant to jump back in. But in what I have played of Mass Effect Andromeda so far, characters, I don't care about anybody. I do not give a rat's ass about any character in that game. Nobody has an interesting personality. Their animations are poor, so it's constantly sucking out of whatever immersion it tries to conjure up because of how just how poorly they move and interact with each other in the world. Whereas with the first 3 Mass Effects, I felt a much greater sense of immersion than I do in Andromeda. Things are so poorly realized, and the execution with how characters are presented to you is so bad, I don't see myself caring about anybody. It'll just be one of those games where you go through and you do missions to get the reward, instead of doing the missions because you feel like you want to be helping a character that you have some sort of connection with. Compare this to earlier BioWare games like Dragon Age Origins, where characters had very real personalities. Alistair is one of my favorite characters of any video game I've played, because he had this level of snark and sarcasm to him that would always kind of be in the back compared with his seriousness and his dedication when it came to certain people that he cared about or certain causes that he was passionate about. He had a definite personality, just like Morgan, just like Liliana. And I can still name them all off the top of my head, because Dragon Age Origins is an amazing video game. Oh, BioWare, what happened to you? Characters have an immense amount to do with the immersion in a video game, and treating them like props or weapon attachments, giving them a throwaway attitude, acting like characters don't care or they shouldn't matter, that can overall hurt your immersion. Few things immerse us in our own world more than how we interact with other people. We're social creatures, and in video games that carries over to a degree. Even though the world, for instance, of Mass Effect Andromeda looks like I could kinda see myself in it as time progresses, if the characters themselves who fill up that world are boring and uninteresting, and they act in these sort of uncanny valley sorts of ways, then I don't know how I could see myself powering through it. Let's take another interesting example in terms of realism and immersion that I think is kind of interesting. One of the things that helps us to immerse ourselves in video games is calls to reality in video games in terms of places and in terms of our own history that we know is real. One of the game series that does this really well is Fallout. Now, for all of its problems, and Fallout 4 has many problems, one of the things I absolutely adored this game for, Fallout 4 was extremely immersive. And that saved that game for me. That saved the game for me. The way that everything was designed, from the coffee cups, to the toys, to the pieces of machinery, to the automobiles, to the billboards, things were designed so well in Fallout 4, it was very easy for me to imagine myself in the Commonwealth. I felt like an explorer in a strange place. I felt like I was a pioneer in a sense. Despite all of the problems Fallout 4 had, I was able to get to every single location that I could find. And I didn't stop playing until I had found all the locations, because of how immersive those locations were, because of how interesting they were, because of how believable all the places were. Despite the monsters, despite the laser beams, despite all that, it was easy to put myself in the shoes of a character rummaging around and scavenging in this hole in the ground, or in this building, or in this old office space. Because Fallout 4 does such a good job at having this central theme, at having this idea that you are in America, and then there is this nuclear fire that envelops the world as far as we know, but everything has that flavor of this 1950s, 1960s retro kind of style to it. It had this consistent theme with how the aesthetics of the items looked. And in the case with at least Fallout 3 especially, you would go to the Capital Wastelands, or in Fallout New Vegas, you would go to Las Vegas, or at least whatever they could muster with the hardware that they had of Las Vegas. These were real places. These are actual places you can go to. You can go to the realistic equivalents to places in a video game. And because it's real, because they have, if you look at a statue of George Washington in a video game, knowing that George Washington was a real person, and having seen statues of George Washington yourself in real life, it is much more easier for you to get a sense of this place is real in this video game. This is a real person after all. Even though I've never been to the Washington Monument, for instance, going there in Fallout 3, it kind of gave me this weird sort of chill the first time I got there. This is the Washington Monument. This is a place that actually exists. I could go here in real life if I wanted to. In Fallout 4, the simple fact that you're in Boston, and they make so many references to Boston, the main city in the world takes place in the baseball stadium there. These are all believable aspects of a post-apocalyptic American society. I hope for Fallout 5, or for Elder Scrolls, whatever the next one is, I hope that they keep all of the guys who were in charge of designing the environments, because they knocked it out of the park when it comes to the design of the Commonwealth and the immersion aspect of the items and the things that fill up the world. And by that, I mean like literally the items that are in the world, not like the characters or anything like that, or the quests. Because to hell with stories and characters that we give a damn about, and backstories. This teapot looks like it's ripped straight from 1953. Oh my god. I feel like I'm actually in the kitchen. Oh, why do they have bullets in the fridge though? I just think it's really weird that, let's take a Wolfenstein The New Order, by the way. Fantastic game. I've played it for about 7 or so hours. And in that 7 hours I've played, I care more about the characters in that game than I did in 120 hours of Fallout 4. You don't necessarily need a long time to care about the people that you meet and be immersed in these worlds. In fact, Wolfenstein The New Order is one of the most immersive games I've played as well. It's crafted so excellently. The details are all right. The grimness of this dystopian alternative history really shine in this game. And they do it in the exact same way that BioShock does it. Really all the BioShocks, but for the most part, BioShock 1 and 2. It does the same thing. It has this Art Deco feel to everything. The designers and the artists who worked on BioShock 1 and 2, they definitely did their homework. They looked at books and buildings. They flipped through all sorts of reference materials to nail this look. This is a city built in the 40s and the 50s. It reflects the style of a time period they are trying to capture, and it does it marvelously. You really feel like you're in an underwater city like Rapture. You know this is total bollocks. This isn't real. It's fantasy in every sense of the word. But you feel like you're there. This is actually I've mentioned 3 games so far that are extremely immersive that take place underwater. Huh. Maybe there's something about that setting. And I guess maybe it's the isolation of the place that really, really gets you immersed. I can probably think of more isolated places than highly populated, busy places that, in terms of immersion, that have really sucked me in. Now that I think about it, I'm not really scripting this or anything, I'm just kind of chatting to myself. But maybe there's something to that. Maybe there's something to the fact that it's easier for developers or creators of these worlds to make games where it's just you and your thoughts. Soma, BioShock, Dead Space. Maybe there's something really to be said about leaving a player to kind of just wander around on their own for the most part. The occasional enemy, surrounded by an immersive atmosphere. Something about it really pulls you in. Dead Space does this too. For the most part, it's just you and enemies and the world around you. There's not much cooperating with other individuals, except maybe here and there. A lot of this, though, has to be up to the individual. Granted, there are things in games that help you to immerse yourself in the worlds. But let's look at 7 Days to Die, for instance. That game doesn't really look all that good at all. But looking back on it, and the, 300 plus hours I have in that game, there has been a lot of times where I've just kind of lost myself, exploring buildings and cities and looking through this and that, hearing zombies shuffling about, trying to rank up and get my experience and make my character better. I don't know. I can't quite put my finger on what exactly it is that immerses me in 7 Days to Die's world. Maybe it's just me. Maybe because I spent so much time growing up reading books and just losing myself in those, it's easier for me to lose myself in the worlds of video games and to be immersed in them. I'm not certain. Going back to the BioShock example, though, because all of the art in BioShock is based on this 50s, late 40s, early 60s Art Deco kind of style, And that style was a real one that existed, and you could, if you live in any city, you could probably walk downtown and look at the buildings and recognize what time period those buildings were built. My parents are architects, so I kind of learned a little about this. But buildings do have styles as time progresses. You can tell the difference between a building made in 1940 from one that was made in 2000. Not just because one is new and shiny, but because of how they're actually constructed. The realism of the fact that in BioShock, the stuff that they're basing everything off of actually did exist, well, that makes it relatable. And being relatable is an important part of immersion. A lot of it has to do with the sound of weapons, for instance. In the medium of video games, since you can't actually feel, you can only see and hear, at least for now. Having good soundtracks, or the lack thereof, sound effects, ambient noises, these are very, very important. In BioShock, you hear the drip-drop of water in the corner, or in Soma, you hear the bubbles popping, or in games like, hell, propaganda being boosted through loudspeakers in Wolfenstein. Sound plays a major part of it, and a lot of the times we don't really notice excellent soundtracks as much as we notice the bad ones. Good soundtracks can make excellent games even more excellent. And in Fallout, for instance, and in the case of Fallout, period-specific songs, songs by Kay Kaiser, by Ink Spots and Bing Crosby, real songs, actual depictions of the real world in video games, well, that just makes it all the more believable. In any event, I just wanted to get some things off my mind in terms of immersion and realism and how they go together and how they oddly kind of seem like they don't work together. I should be going part-time at my job either next week or the week after that, so I'll have all the more time for me to focus on this stuff. I've just been really preoccupied this week. I've got some stuff lined up in the really close future, so expect a few things from me really soon. Thanks for listening. I just wanted to get some stuff off my chest. Not rant, but just kind of talk a bit. A video game's ability to pull me out of my world and into it, that's the mark that they did something right. And it's something not everybody can do, let alone do well.